All right, everybody. Thanks for joining us for the last session of the day in this IT Leader track. My name's Tim Zonka. I run product marketing at Puppet, and so we're thrilled to have you here. And one of the things that my team has been spending a lot of time on is one of the common themes that you've seen in the conference so far is just working with our customers, our users, as they're adopting new technology. So I'm thrilled to have a couple gentlemen join me today who are helping their organizations do the same sort of thing. So we have Jeffery Snover. He is a technical fellow at Microsoft. And Ted Newman, who is the head of cloud services at the Royal Bank of Scotland. So gentlemen, it's great to have you here. Where I'd like to start is with something that, for those of you who watched our founder give the keynote today, one of the things that he said was that he talked about as people adopt new technology, that there's this glassy-eyed, shiny vision of the future, and then the threat of moving those sorts of workloads or those sorts of technologies into production starts to sneak in, and it threats that shiny vision and tarnishes it a bit. And he was kind of chuckling as he said this, and I was thinking, so both of you have different perspectives on that. I'm curious to get your take. What are you seeing going on out there? Is a cloud or from a container perspective, any sorts of examples where you see that shiny ideas start to get tarnished and the impact that it has when you need to move these sorts of new technologies or start to adopt them in new ways in production. So Jeffrey, maybe kick things off and let's hear your take on that.
Yeah, sure. The Gartner guys have a great phrase for this, right? They call it the hype cycle. They say, new technology comes out and it has this peak hype where, it's going to solve every problem known to mankind. I don't know what the problem is. I know what the solution is. And then there's this encounter with reality. And that encounter with reality, you realize, the shortcomings of that technology. This is true, but blah, blah, blah. And so then it goes into this time versus hype. There's a peak of hype, and then there's this trough of despair. As everyone's like, it's all useless. We were idiots, we got sucked in. And then at some point you go through that trough of despair and you realize, what is the technology good for? How is it useful, et cetera? And really most technologies go through that. And then some people are just so excited by their technology that they try and just ramp it up that hype curve because the bigger hype they're looking for the exit play, right? I'll convince everybody in the world this is going to do everything, sell my company before we hit the trough of despair. Other people that's not what position I'm in. We're a pretty well-established company at Microsoft, and so I spend a lot of time trying to be very specific about new technology and where it's good for and where it's not, and try and moderate those expectations. Like, for instance, NanoServer. NanoServer is a new deployment option of Windows Server 2016. I'm wildly excited about it, but I'm very clear with people. I say, look, if you're like this is not for you. It will be in the future, but it's not for you. It is for these people and those people, and that's it. Mm-hmm. And I'm in the luxury. I'm not trying to sell my company.
Sure.
Cash out before the trough of despair hits in. I'm trying to avoid that trough of despair by setting expectations.
That makes sense. So Ted, what about you? You have to deal with the reality of that on the ground with your teams.
So when I was doing a lot of technical architecture, we had a saying, right? Runs great in PowerPoint. We kind of still fight that today, where often heavily regulated banking industry, right? Still so much is dependent on the mainframe. New technology, oftentimes in the bank, was something that was a solution in search of a problem. Mm-hmm. Right, so we would have these groups, with great titles like the Innovation Team or the Open Experience Lab or this, that, or the other thing. They would bring in these new technologies and they'd run a sprint and they'd stand up some super cool capability that absolutely no application was asking for. And so then it would die in development, right? And it kind of became a blocker in and of itself because we had all these cool solutions in search of a problem that when it came time to really bring in a new technology that actually solved a problem, there was disillusionment that it would ever get out of development, right? So then it became a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Mm-hmm. And stuff would just continue to languish there. So as Jeffrey mentioned, what we have to do is we've moved from a technology-driven approach to bringing in new technologies to an outcome-driven approach where we're saying, here's a problem that we want to solve. This tool is going to solve, or this technology or what have you, is going to solve this problem. If your problem looks like this, or your application looks like this, meets this profile, then it's for you. And we might expand on the problem that we're trying to solve, or the number of profiles is appropriate for, or whatever. But initially, it only solves this one problem, right? And then we'll let it grow from there, as opposed to trying to bring something in as the silver bullet, be all and end all, and then the first time that somebody turns up with something and it doesn't work for them, right? Despair, disillusionment, et cetera. Yeah, exactly. I don't know if that was the seppuku movement there.
No, it's the ripcord.
The ripcord. Okay.
So Ted, what about the sorts of problems that you solve as it relates to the cloud services team? Are they largely net new problems, that those are net new environments, or is your team also working on moving existing solutions and technology to either more modern infrastructure or the cloud, or what's the mix?
Yeah, if you want to move the needle at the bank, you have to be able to attack the legacy applications as well. So what we're in the process of doing is standing up one set of converged infrastructure that's going to provide virtual infrastructure, infrastructure as a service, and platform as a service out to our application owners. And the approach that we're taking is, initially the scope was just the virtual infrastructure, which is interesting but not really compelling, right? Because all we were doing was lifting and shifting legacy applications off of 6 or 8-year-old hardware and putting it onto brand new shiny hardware. We weren't remediating the operating system. We weren't updating any of the software, et cetera. So, we could guarantee hardware currency for some period of time, but that was it.
Okay.
So what we're trying to do is say, all right, if you can move on to infrastructure as a service, I can guarantee you hardware and operating system currency. If I can get you all the way up to platform as a service, I'm going to guarantee you hardware, operating system, and software currency, right? So ideally, I'd like to run infrastructure as a service inside the bank for 2 years as like a transitory thing to push as much as possible onto platform as a service, right? Because that's really when you can make some big changes and address a lot more of your application profile, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I've drank the Kool-Aid, but.
Well, and so, Jeffrey, you see a much broader swath of people who probably maybe aren't doing it as gracefully as that. So what, across that movement of people looking at their maybe traditional deployment of infrastructure, moving to, either Azure or Azure Stack, any patterns you see where success is either more likely or less likely depending on the practices that they take to get there?
Well, sure. Everybody who's adopting, DevOps, they tend to be more successful than the folks that don't. And why is that? And the answer to me, I go to a lot of DevOps conferences, and there's a lot of conversation about what is DevOps. I've never walked away from a conference with one of those conversations where people said, well, that settles that. To me, however, there's always this one thread, and it's all about putting the customer and the customer value proposition at the forefront and the focus of everything you do, and you re-engineer around that. And when you do that, there's a set of practices that fall out. Small batches, repeatable processes, which means configuration as code, configuration management, et cetera. And when people follow those processes, they tend to succeed. Why do they tend to succeed? Because they're doing everything to drive the customer value proposition forward. So in other words, their heads and their hearts are in the right place, and all their activities are focused in on driving the business forward. Guess what? If you're driving the business forward, it turns out people like you. If you're just like, oh, look, I got more IOPS. Like, okay, is that interesting? Like, oh, look what business impact I had. People like that. So now that, whether you're doing that with bare metal provisioning of your own hardware or infrastructure as a service or using out-hosting or cloud services, those techniques are independent of that. Now, I will point out, Ted said it well, the big phenomena that I see between that's going to differentiate the folks that do okay versus the folks that do great are those folks that figure out how to build the things that differentiate them and buy the things that don't. You know, so often there's a lot of folks who get really wrapped up in doing their own infrastructure. And I just ask, hey, can you really sell more cars because you can figure out the Dell catalog and figure out how to put these pieces together and configure a tour? Right. Like, I don't believe that's really true. Like, maybe you do, but honestly, I don't think it's true. Can you put more people in an airplane? Can you make somebody happier because you figured out how to do that? And the answer is generally no. So those folks that are able to just say, hey, I'm going to buy that, right? I'm not going to think about it. I'm not going to put my best people on that. I'm going to buy that. Jeffrey Moore has this great concept of core versus context, which is basically that. At Microsoft, our core is software. We're a software company. So we scour the world for the best and brightest software people. But we have these context things, right? We have to have cafeterias, we have to have services, you know, we have to have receptionists. There are no technical fellows of the cafeteria, right? We just write a big check and say, yep, we want great cafeterias, big check, happy, happy, but we're not going to invest any of our best people in that.
That makes sense. So one of the conversations that anytime I talk about you know, moving to the cloud or evolving cloud practices with any of the customers or users that I meet with, I almost can never leave the conversation without talking about portability. And so, you know, the idea is like, well, we want to, you know, package up these workloads in a way that we can move them wherever the heck we want. I have no idea if that's ever going to be a reality, but it's a big part of the conversation. So I'm curious to get, one, your take as a tech provider that needs to consider this, and then Ted, your take as, you know, how much do you care? How much do you think it's going to be a reality from you know, an actual kind of at the, you know, kind of at the coalface perspective? So maybe Jeffrey, you start there. And
yeah, so it's a very common theme, and when you pull on the thread and like, what's behind that? It's all about choice, right? People don't want to have vendor lock-in, right? Very noble thing, great stuff. I'll point out that most people have vendor lock-in. It's called Intel. Anybody running ARM servers? Right, you're bought into Intel, full stop. Okay, so there's a lot of vendor lock-in, and nobody really complains about that if it gives them what they need. So then I'll point out that, so people they want to have choice. They don't want to be in a position where they have one vendor that can then dictate prices to them. That's the thing you really have to avoid. So they think that, okay, well, if I can now work with different heterogeneous clouds, I can achieve that. I'm very pessimistic about that. Let's just take a look at, you know, this has been a common thing, right? Remember back in the days of the early PC, there were all these cross-platform GUI frameworks? I mean, what simpler is there in the world than a GUI framework, right? Throw up a dialog box, put this text in it, have OK. And Borland had one, and there were all these other vendors that had these things. And where are they, right? Anybody using Borland? No. God, okay. There's some really smart people still using Borland.
By choice?
Okay, well, there were these platforms, and ultimately they all failed. Right? They all failed. And you could say, well, over the course of time, HTML emerged as that cross-platform thing. And indeed, it did. How long did that take? A really long time. A really long time for a relatively simple problem, GUIs. I will also point out, if you take a look at your phone, all those phones, most of the applications are not written in HTML. So even there, the reality is when it matters, they go and differentiate. So I think the same thing. Now that's with GUIs. The cloud services are going to offer so much dramatic benefit. It's far more complex. The difference between the same set of services across heterogeneous clouds is going to provide a lowest common denominator. I think you're going to leave a ton of value on the floor. Now, this stuff is now for what? For business applications, stuff where it really, really matters. So I'm very pessimistic about these cross-platform models. Now, I'm very optimistic about our play to address this issue of vendor choice. Of course I would be. I'm from Microsoft. I'm going to tell you why. I mean, that's why I work there, because I'm very excited and I'm building the platform based upon this. And that is, we're taking Azure and we're making Azure Stack. That's the thing I'm in charge of. Azure Stack takes the heart of Azure and allows you to run that on your data centers, on your own servers, and through service providers. And so what this does is it solves that problem of, I would like to have choice, but I also want to take advantage of the full power of the underlying platform. So you can get Azure services from the public cloud. You can go to a trusted provider in a country of your choice, or you can run it on your own services. So
Makes sense,
that's
yeah.
our approach to addressing that problem.
So what's your reality around that, the idea of portability?
Well, I'm going to agree with you about the whole heterogeneous, multi-cloud approach. I think, as I mentioned, I want to run infrastructure as a service for as little time as possible because there is no value in somebody figuring out how to get, a DNS and routing and all this other kind of stuff working in our private cloud or in the public cloud, right? If I really want to add value, I want to add it where it's differentiated. So I'd much rather run on-prem Cloud Foundry and off-prem Cloud Foundry and broker through there. I think the other interesting thing about portability is, you can be portable if you can build, right? So the idea doesn't have to be that I can package something up and move it around. It can be portable if I can rebuild it, right? Which is why I like Puppet, right? Because I can say, go build it on this endpoint or build it on that endpoint and be able to do that. It doesn't have to mean that everything has to be exactly the same in order for it to be portable. It just has to mean that I have to know how to do that build in those places. There's a lot of value in the concept of, define it once and be able to run it in many different places. I'd much rather see us define portability that way than by having some sort of a cloud broker, right, that tries to disintermediate stuff for you and define things that are quasi-containers and deploy them other places, right? I feel like we've already solved the problem. We're just trying to complicate the problem to have new solutions to it. So, eventually I'd rather just get to the point where we're doing PaaS and, Azure's, I think, going, down the right path with that approach, right? Let your platform run wherever. It doesn't matter. There isn't a lot of differentiating, capability if it's running on this hardware or that hardware. If it's running in your data center or somebody else's data center, I'd rather focus on the things that are important, like is it controlled? Can I report on it? Is it secure, et cetera, et cetera. I don't need hardware for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. As I talk about this differentiation, the build versus buy, I often would say, and there's a group of people that really do get big value out of infrastructure, and I'd say, and the answer is Microsoft, AWS, Google, and some service providers. That's sort of their core competence. And I say, and the reality is that I deal with a lot of Wall Street banks, and they have made a lot of investment in this. They think that's one of the differentiators. So I was very shocked this year to be invited to Wall Street, along with AWS and Google, and there was a bunch of Wall Street bankers who had come and basically said that they had come to the conclusion that infrastructure is not something they want to invest in, that they want to just write a check, and they said, we're going to compete at the application layer, not at how well we can deploy infrastructure. Now, here's the things that we need from your infrastructure. We need this level of security, we need this level of auditing, et cetera. And so they were going to each of us saying, hey, come to these levels. So that was a
Well, it seems reminiscent of your idea of like the context versus core. Like that has is shifting.
Yep.
I want to jump topic slightly, which is one of the things that I've talked to a bunch of our users and customers just over the last couple of days, and one of the trends that I notice is, as I talk to them about, well, what are you doing around blank? And sometimes they can go on and on about what they're doing around a certain set of technology. And in other cases, you say, well, what are you doing around Kubernetes or Docker or Nano? Well, that's another team. Or vice versa. And there's something else where they point to another team. And one of the things that I haven't been able to put my finger on is what makes the teams that are awesome from when it's that other team doing the new stuff, pulling it into the fold of now going from experiment to production with that new technology. So Ted, I'm curious to get your take first, which is, do you have any people on your team where the experimenters gracefully, tricks that they have for bringing experiments gracefully through the pipeline to actually make them, hey, we're ready to start to run this in production and at scale, and those handoffs are in place, or where do you skin your knees on that?
So I'm at the bank because we can't do that, to be honest.
Okay.
So we realized last year that that kind of transformation required folks that weren't currently inside the bank. So the CTO went out and got myself on board and a gentleman who's running our Agile and DevOps transformation, and then another gentleman who's running our security transformation. And essentially realized that we need to change agents from outside in order to be able to do that change. Because
interesting.
I mentioned earlier, right, that innovation was happening in various parts inside the bank, but then it was just dying in dev. It was never making it into production because test and dev were run by one part of the organization, and production was run by another part of the organization. So there was literally a passport to production, right? And you had gate guards standing up and saying, papers, please, and then they would find any excuse, right, not to let you into production. So that was the overarching mindset that was in place, which was, we need to be secure, and to be secure, that means nobody gets in, right? And that can't work. And somebody else in one of the earlier sessions today was talking about that, just that fear of change or fear of any kind of new risk to the environment. And so the response was, well, if one checklist helps us be safer, then 2 checklists would help us be even more safe, right?
What about 3?
Right, yeah. Like, can I get 4 checklists? Yeah, let's do 4. So what we're doing, so I'm the infrastructure dude, right? And then the DevOps guy, I call him my partner, right? We're like wearing 3-legged pants because we're in every meeting together. But it's important to ensure that as we're doing the operating model transformation, we're doing the infrastructure transformation so that these things can flow into production. So we're moving to long-lived teams, moving away from a project-based funding to theme-based funding, and also removing the wall between dev and test and production, so that we'll have one team that's responsible all the way across for the infrastructure from cradle to grave. And then the expectation is we're launching these new services as products. They will have a product owner, right? Azure and Amazon have already showed us how to run these kinds of products, right? There's somebody who's responsible for EC2 inside Amazon, right? If we're going to offer infrastructure as a service, there should be somebody who wakes up and that's all they care about inside our organization. I don't want to run it for very long, but we need to be able to offer an alternative. Because right now, the alternative to AWS and Azure is the mainframe and the 4 checklists and all that kind of stuff, right? That's not a choice. You can't make a business decision that says, no, really, it should go over here. You're making a technology decision at that point, right? I need something quickly, therefore I'm going to go to Amazon or Azure. That's not the reason I want to go to Amazon or Azure, right? I want to go there because they have some kind of capability or something that I don't want to build myself, and therefore it's the right way. That's a business decision. So we're trying to get to that space, and it's that's why we're relying very heavily on the let's buy and not build this stuff, right? There's no badge of honor that comes with having the most complex and best infrastructure in the world as a bank if it doesn't get you a net new one customer, right? So that somebody earlier today was mentioning that's got to be the focus, right? How am I improving my bottom line? You can improve the bottom line by taking cost out or by getting me more revenue, right? And what is it about our engineering culture that does either one of those things from an infrastructure perspective?
And so, Jeffrey, I'm curious to get your take, because hearing you talk through that, Ted, one of the things that's apparent is, I guess, the spectrum across which your team has to operate from, moving forward, but at the same time dealing with kind of the realities that you currently deal with. I think one of the things I've seen coming out of your team that's been really impressive over the last little bit is kind of this mix of if it's Azure or Azure Stack, or if it's Server 2016, with Nano, like you can run it kind of as more of the traditional aspect of Windows Server, or you can incorporate some of the new Nano and container-like stuff. How do you think about, so it's obvious that you're thinking something about bringing these people forward, so how do you think about at Microsoft making sure that you're including the right sort of mix, the right interoperability, so regardless where people like Ted's team is across that spectrum, you can kind of come in at the right spots?
Yeah, so when we did planning, we were pretty thoughtful about our planning process. And basically we had 3, what we called voices. We had voice of the business. These are people who went out and looked at the marketplace, understood what the big trends were, where the money was, et cetera. Then we had a group of people that was the voice of the customer. They would talk to our customers about their pain points, their aspirations, et cetera. And then there was the voice of technology. I ran the voice of technology, where we looked at the various things that were on the radar screen, things that we could take advantage of, et cetera. And then we had long, conversations where we educated people, each other, about these various things. And then collectively, we went and put together these value propositions. And then we were very mindful about what was we were trying to accomplish, what the customer value proposition was going to be, what the scenarios were going to be, how we were going to measure those scenarios, how that translated into features. So there was this entire engineering value chain, an engineering system built around the value that we were going to deliver to customers. And as week by week we went through and said, okay, so here were the things we were going to try and achieve. Where are we? And so we stopped talking about, all this code's here or there. It's like, okay, here's how much of the scenario I've developed. Here are my, what we call CTQs, critical to quality measurements, and here are we on those measurements. So again, sort of like this very engineering approach to driving and delivering customer quality and customer value. And so we knew, as part of the voice of technology, I knew, hey, we've got a great operating system. Incredibly successful, massive business, great operating system. However, as you move to the cloud, something different was needed. Now at the time, everyone's looking and saying, what are you talking about? Refactoring the operating system, are you crazy? I mean, that's going to be incredibly painful, and what? I mean, I'm already doing a great business. And we said, well, no, here's the reason why. In the cloud, you need to be cloud competitive. You need to be small. You need to be fast. You need to be efficient. And there's this change happening, right? In the past, servers were very expensive. So you buy a server and everything was server focused. You'd buy a server engineer and he managed the server, and then you try and amortize the cost of that server by running as many things on it as possible. But in the world now, that's not at all the case, right? Servers are relatively inexpensive, and the focus is now the application. And so with the application, you want that to be the center of the world, and you only want the things necessary to drive that application as part of the operating system. If it doesn't help the application, get rid of it. And so we knew that that world was coming, and so that allowed us to have the courage to do the really incredibly hard work to refactor the operating system. Here's a little thing. I joined Microsoft in '99. So '99, that was sort of in the midst of the big government antitrust case. And I remember, I was not a big fan of Microsoft in those days. I don't know how I got there, but I remember, that's true. And I remember hearing this like, oh, well, we can't remove the browser from the operating system. And I remember thinking to myself, what a load of crap that is, I mean, like, I can see these guys trying to pull the wool over some lawyers or judges' eyes, but I'm an engineer. I know that's garbage. That's crap. And then I got in and I looked at the code and it's like, oh my Lord. Like, no, that wasn't crap. That was true. I mean, it was all just with one big glop, right? I mean, we had the kernel calling IE API. I mean, it's just insane. And so what does that mean? Well, if you see, we've been on this path to refactor the operating system for the better part of the 17 years that I've been there. Server core was a major stepping stone in that. But that was still large, right? So now server with the desktop, that's about 9 or 10 gigabytes. Server core, that's the headless version, that's about 5 or 6 gigabytes. Nano server, 480 megabytes. 480 megabytes. This thing is fast, small, light as the wind, and it required an incredible amount of effort. Why? Because why were we able to make such an incredible investment when all of our business indicators were telling us we're doing great? And it was because we were able to look out, see the future, and integrate that into a customer value proposition.
So I realize I've been hogging all the questions here. So after this, I have many more, but I want to at least get one more out. But as I do so, you all think of ones that you'd like to ask the gentleman up here, and then I'll open it up in just a moment. But Ted, I have one for you before we see if anyone out there has a question, which is one of the things I heard Jeffrey talking about is kind of your user-centric approach to kind of figuring out when and how should we deliver these sorts of things. As you deliver either new technology, new services, new offerings to your users, what sort of lens do you put them through? Like, what are any common threads that you like your team to really listen for or focus on?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. One is, as we were looking at what should we build, we did a couple of things, right? Which was to say, let's not spend a bunch of time trying to engineer the right solution, because we had a problem where we would engineer something to be perfect. As an example, we've been engineering our Red Hat Enterprise Linux build for version 7 for the last 24 months. So I don't know what we're doing to Red Hat Enterprise Linux that Red Hat didn't do. I don't think it took them 24 months to turn on 7, right? So we wanted to be sure that we weren't falling into the engineering for engineering's sake's trap, right? We have an issue where we have a design team. Well, we have to have a design document because we have a design team. You know what I mean? So it's like you can become trapped by your own processes. So we wanted to do a couple of things. One was, let's take a look at what is the business spending their money on at Amazon and Azure today. That's probably a pretty good indicator of what we should be building, right? Mm-hmm. So we don't need to go and build like a whole bunch of really complicated multi-VM blueprints to deploy a whole bunch of stuff when all they're buying is EC2, right? So we wanted to have a data-driven conversation. First thing you got to do is go and get some data. And we also took a look at, okay, we've identified a whole bunch of servers that we want to turn off and migrate into virtual infrastructure. So let's run some analysis on what's out there. How much is SQL Server being used? How much is WebSphere being used, et cetera, et cetera. And then let's do some analysis on, well, what does that look like? Is there 2 buckets or 3 buckets that we could put stuff into? So we wanted to have the data conversation, we wanted to have data as part of the conversation so we could go to an application owner and say, okay, here's what you're using today. Maybe you're using Oracle 10. Why are you using Oracle 10 versus 12, right? There could be a really good reason. So we wanted to be able to have the conversation with them that was driven based on what do they currently have today, how does that paint a technology debt picture for them, and then how can we solve that problem for them, as opposed to standing up a bunch of new infrastructure or services or whatever that sound really good in the engineering echo chamber. Oh man, they would love it if we had Docker files. None of these guys can use Docker right now, right? So there's no reason to stand it up. So nobody had ever from technology turned up to the business and said, here's an accounting of your technical debt, right? And so we wanted to change the conversation. And for too long, right, the conversation was the application owner turned up and said, we want to run this new application. The vendor says it would run best on DL380s, and it'd be great if the disk spun at 10,000 RPMs. And could you use the error control correcting RAM? I heard that stuff's really good. It's like they're giving you a laundry list and they say go deploy it, and we wonder why we have 1,500 snowflakes sitting on the data center floor. So we wanted to change the conversation to, we know you have to run these apps. We know it costs you a lot of money to run those apps. Oh, and by the way, we're really slow at provisioning this for you. Here's how we can start to solve those problems for you, right? And if we were to offer Oracle 12 and be able to get you a database server in 2 days, would that be of value to you? Would you want to go through the process of migrating your app off of 10 onto 12? Yeah, we would love it. It completely changed the approach that we're taking to the application owner. It's no longer us versus them. It's we really need to be a provider to you, and a provider comes to you with solutions, right? So straight a little bit from your question.
No, but that makes sense, yeah. So I know Michael in back has a microphone, and so if you have a question that you want us to take right now, let's hear him. What do you got for us? I don't believe it. Really? There we go.
You said you were talking about looking ahead for the Microsoft products for the last 15 years. What's your average roadmap time Is it 15 years? Is it 5 years? How far ahead are you looking forward to solutions and what customers are asking for?
Yeah, it varies based upon the technology. So, we are close partners with Intel, so we're talking to them about, some stuff that's pretty far out, and then what are the things we need to do to be able to take advantage of that. Other times it's, short term. So I'd say it varies, but in general, sort of 3 to 5 years is sort of the sweet spot. Stuff beyond that, it's hard to have actions. You can have small investments. You want to, so here's the question. The interesting question is, at what time frames do you do what level of investment? And the longer the time frame, you could just say, well, I'll just kind of be aware of it and keep track. Often what you want to do is you want to have some level of investment to be able to disambiguate and to find out, because some of those things are not that far out. They come pretty quickly. And then other times, anyway.
You're not facing a lot of dead ends, but you sort of have to invest that little amount to find a dead end to make sure it's a dead end. You still have to send somebody down that road to make sure it's a dead end.
You've got it exactly right. Yep.
What else? I have one related to that. I'm curious, Ted, how do you think about, we'll take yours in just a moment. How does your organization think about road mapping and levels of investment in the kind of the near term versus long term?
Yeah, well, so everything was always long term, right? Because it took us like 36 months to be able to roll out a project. And as part of the operating model change, we're moving towards rolling wave planning and being able to do monthly reprioritization of the portfolio, which is great. I think we will probably start with rolling wave planning on the quarter level, right? Because I don't think we're just, that's too much of a change. But we definitely are looking to move from an approach where we fired cannonball after cannonball after cannonball to one where we're firing bullets and then cannonballs, right? So, the idea of, we want to have a bank-wide API. Okay, well, let's go and spend a couple £1 million with IBM to get the best, possible messaging system in place, and because someday we might run millions of calls through our API. We're moving to being, let's start with maybe an open source solution and see if we can, get this stood up and get it working. So that's a big part of the change. From an investment perspective, for our infrastructure, we're definitely looking 3 to 5 years to make sure that we're not painting ourselves in any corners. But then from, what technologies do I need to bring in from the bank perspective? It's probably, a 6-month window of what are some capabilities that we're looking for, because everything's changing so fast, right? If you just look at the NoSQL space, right? Can't throw a rock without hitting a new NoSQL startup. So who knows what's going to be the best one within a quarter? What we want to do is make it easier to swap those technologies in and out, so we don't feel like we're locked to something because we've gone and spent, 10 million pounds on an ELA for 5 years.
Yeah.
Right? We're trying to get out of that
makes sense.
mode.
Gentleman in the back, you had a question?
Sure, this may not be right on topic in terms of data center tomorrow, but I'd be interested in Jeffrey's opinion or vision around how does AI impact some of these conversations and Internet of Things?
And I'm just going to repeat the question for the recording.
Yeah.
So how does AI and the Internet of Things affect the sort of things that you think about and work on?
Yeah, so AI is one of those things that we've been looking at for a while, and that one's coming on fast. It really is. That's one of those things that, we've been talking about AI for what, 70s, 80s, yeah. But it's really coming on strong and having big effects. We are using AI, we're investing massively in AI, and we're using it in lots of different places. One of the biggest right now is security. Using AI against Active Directory calls and conversations and logon patterns to detect things. We're informing people of problems they did not know they had, and boy, that's an interesting conversation to have with folks. And one of the what allowed this to happen, and there's two answers. So the first is, of course, the massive increase in computing, massive decrease in cost, massive increase in computing. The second is these massive data sets, right? Because we're able to take a look at so much, we're able to look at the bulk of things and get the patterns, and the patterns allow us to disambiguate the abnormalities. So we're doing that in lots of different places. We're also investing heavily in computation to make that stuff work well. Whether it's let me give you another example. It's slightly different, but so for instance, we're invested heavily in AI. We're also invested in field programmable gate arrays, right? Field programmable gate arrays, right? So one of the jokes was, I was going to make the joke, hey, how many of you have, you talk about where you invest to have value? And one of the jokes is, how many of you are investing in your own CPU design? Well, turns out we are. We're building these field programmable gate arrays. We're putting them on all new Azure servers to maximize. Basically, what we're doing with these is to accelerate our networking stack to minimize the energy, the latency, and the CPU cycles per bit transferred. Okay, and so this gives us incredible benefit. And why do we do that? And the answer is, for these massive, whether it's microservices or these algorithms that deal with large data sets, the ability to have very low, it's all about sort of replacing the internal backplane of a computer with an external network. If you can have a very low latency, very high bandwidth network, you can do things that you couldn't otherwise do. Sorry, you asked about that, and you asked about IoT. IoT, here's the thing about IoT. At the end of the day, IoT is going to be a data play. That's my view, right? So there's all sorts of great stuff. You can take a look at the numbers. The numbers are already massive. They're going to get more massive. There's all sorts of issues, right? People who aren't treating IoT with enough security, that's a problem. It'll get fixed. The big play on IoT is all about data, right? IoT things generate what? They generate data, and that data offers the potential for business value. How are you going to take all this data and produce business value? And the answer is big data analytics and artificial intelligence. So yeah, there's definitely a play there.
So we have a few minutes left, and go ahead.
I just had a quick question on Azure Stack, and we were looking at bringing in private cloud into our data center, but when we looked at Azure Stack, it seemed that we needed to buy a specific hardware with it.
Yep.
Are you getting more companies? Because we're a little bit specific to a company that you guys don't have that with. I was just wondering, are more companies working with you to get it on their stuff, or are you guys going to open it up so it's not so specific to hardware?
So we're very specific to a set of requirements, and then a bunch of vendors meet those requirements, and a bunch of vendors say, oh, we think we can do it better. It's like, okay, great, go do something else. Here are our requirements. And then those guys have come back, and turns out their customers want them to do that, so they've come back to us and say, hey, let's put together a roadmap to be able to do that. So no, that list will grow. And a lot of people are kind of not quite getting Azure Stack. They're projecting their hopes and dreams and ambitions into Azure Stack. I went to Ignite this year, and I called it my disabuse campaign, right? I was trying to avoid that hype cycle, to be very clear about what Azure Stack is and what it isn't. And here's the higher order bit. Azure Stack is Azure running on your platforms, running in your data centers. Now, what does that mean? Is it all of the services? No, we have content distribution networks in Azure. Those aren't going to be there. So it's the core set of services that allow applications to go in both places. But again, the higher order bit is consistency with Azure. So here's the question. Do you get to tell Azure what hardware to run your VMs on? Answer, no. Oh, do I get to tell Azure what security agent I want running in the hypervisor? Answer, no. Azure provides a service. It provides an integrated service. It provides you all the patching of your infrastructure, et cetera. That's what we're going to do with Azure Stack. That's why I'm taking the hardcore decisions on having things like, these are the systems we're going to support, the criteria. We are going to be doing patching of not just the operating system. We're going to be patching the firmware. We're going to be patching the firmware in the drives. We're going to be doing that on a monthly basis as it's available with service level maintenance, right? The service continues to be maintained. Anybody doing that? I don't think so. We're going to do that. So it's absolutely secure. I can't do that with random hardware. I got to know what the hardware is, and I need it to meet our requirements. Next, we have this notion of a sealed host. The sealed host means the software running on the host is sealed. It's the stuff we put on there. It's our software and the certified drivers from vendors. People say, oh, I'd like to have my security agent there. Can you do that with Azure? No. So why am I being such a hard ass on the sealed host? And here's the answer. As I've talked to customers about, hey, we got a great new version of the operating system, and they'd say, oh, that's fantastic, I'd love to move to it. I say, well, why aren't you moving to it? Invariably, the answer is, hey, I'd love to, but I've got this third-party software, and they're not ready on that new version of the software. I have this third-party software, and they're available on the new version of the operating system, but they want me to relicense. I got to buy the thing all over again. Or I have this third-party software, and they're now out of business, so I can never go to that new version. The value of Azure Stack is consistency with Azure. So when a version of Azure comes out within a fairly short time frame, I need everybody in the world on that version of Azure. So I cannot allow anything that's going to get in the way of people adopting the latest version. So that's why we're being pretty hardcore on it. And here's the thing, it's not for everybody. If you say, hey, I can't meet that, that's fine. We have great other software. It's called virtualization. In virtualization, great capabilities, and you're in control of everything. You get to pick whatever hardware you want. You get to configure it however you want. You can do everything. We got great tools to help you with that, but you do the systems integration.
So a couple things. I want to thank all of you for joining us today and your questions. Especially thank you two gentlemen for joining us. It was good to get a chance to talk with you. I see a bunch of people on their way likely to the party soon, so I don't want to hold us up any longer. We hope to see you all there. And once again, guys, thanks a lot. It was great to have you here. Thanks. Thanks, Jeffery.